Thanks everyone. Good evening. Obviously, it's a pleasure to speak to you tonight. Thank you very much to Jewel and the Brisbane Community Forum. A lot of volunteer work goes into these sort of events, so it's much appreciated, and it's a chance to exchange ideas, in an open and honest way. So that's fantastic. A special guest, the Honourable Malcolm Roberts. I've had Kelvin Thompson, former Labor MP, at one of my events, and he said that anyone who was in the Parliament retains the Honourable. So welcome to the Honourable Malcolm Roberts. Are there any other special guests I should be aware of? I mean, you're all special, of course, but it's great to be here anyway. So the question, obviously, is one of the policies that we look at in our party, Sustainable Australia, is population, and that's obviously the focus of the talk tonight. And the question is, Australia better or bigger? And you can probably see from our slogan, on the first one, is better, not bigger. So you may reach a conclusion initially, but let me talk you through it. In terms of Sustainable Australia, we are an independent party. We're not formed out of big unions or big business. We call it the common sense political centre, with a positive agenda. We must admit we don't get bogged down in things like identity politics. We really want to focus on key issues that we think matter to the broad spectrum of Australians. We prioritise 4 big issues. They are jobs, housing, planning and environment. And to pad that out a little bit, it's secure jobs via a more diverse economy, affordable housing for first home buyers and renters, better planning to stop overdevelopment, and a sustainable environment and population. First and foremost, population is an environmental issue. But it's obviously, we call it the everything issue because it absolutely relates to economics, infrastructure, blah, blah, blah. So we'll talk a bit more about that. So those 4 key policies that we really focus on, jobs, housing, planning, environment, they sit within a broader 20-point policy platform, but our priority is those big 4. So obviously tonight is about population. We believe it's critical to include population reform in, broadly speaking, Australia's policy mix on a whole range of issues, including, to secure jobs and wage growth, affordable housing, better planning and a sustainable environment. As a quick snapshot of Australia's population growth, back in 1999, not long ago at all, just around the time of the Olympics in Sydney, we had a population of around 19 million people. The government at that stage predicted that our population would grow to 25 million at about 2050. Yeah. So that was basically half a century they said we would grow to that degree. And that was based on, roughly speaking, our long-term average immigration rate of about 70,000 people per year. Tens of thousands of people leave Australia every year as well, so it's a net overseas migration relatively low, so it gives us more sustainable, slower growth than today. So they were saying the ABS was predicting around 25 million at about 2050, and that it would be around a stable population, roughly stable, because our fertility rate in Australia, the number of children per woman, is around 2, just below 2, about 1.8. So overall, our population policy de facto really is about immigration. At the moment, what then happened, if you wouldn't mind, thanks for that, Jewel. What then happened is that under John Howard, it went from under 100,000 a year to over 200,000 a year. So the 100-year average of about 70,000 per year, which worked so well for Australia in the 20th century, that was tripled in a very, very short space of time under John Howard. And it was the same time that he distracted us with boats and the Tampa and so forth. So they used, let's stop the boats, and under that, they sort of distracted us, a bit of a 2-card trick. and they significantly increased the migration by plane. That 200,000 has stood in place now for well over 10 years, and it's roughly made up of about 120,000 people in the skilled category. However, that includes the family of the skilled migrant. So only about half of that skilled category is actually the primary person, the skilled migrant, and the rest is husband or wife and children and so forth. About 70,000 family reunion, and parents, partners, etc. And about 14 to 20,000 refugees is the rough makeup of that 200 odd thousand. So note that despite about 90% of the news being about refugees, it's only about 10% of the actual immigration intake. So it's a bit disproportionate there. We're now on track to reach, Jewel, about 40 million by 2050, instead of roughly the 25, 26, 27 million that we think we can still achieve if we adopt our preference, which we can talk through a bit later. But so they're the two options at 2050. From 2000, about 19 million, we could have stabilised well under 30 million and still could. However, we're going to 40 million, and it doesn't stop there. It goes to 80 odd million this century. So the doubling time is roughly 30 or 40 years. So the first doubling, 20 to 40 million in 30, 40 years. The second doubling is 40 to 80 million in the same period again. And then the next doubling is 80 to 160, etc. So it's, if you go at the same growth rate. What are the impacts of rapid population growth? And I'll just take you through these quickly. The first one, obviously, what we've seen there from around the time that John Howard did ramp it up in the mid-2000s, we had wage growth roughly around the 3 to 4% per year. That's pretty traditional. It's gone down now to record low wage growth of between 1.5% under 2%. So we're seeing record low wage growth at the same time. Now, it's not the only factor. We certainly don't say that population growth is the only factor, but again, I'll just repeat, it's one of the reform policies we need to make, and it's a central reform policy. Otherwise, often you're just swimming against the tide. You might put a few things in place, but if you're not dealing with population, you're really undermining your efforts. Housing. So back 1975, the average house was about 4 times income. Now much of Sydney and Melbourne in particular, it's about 12 times average income. So it's around 3 times more difficult for people entering the housing market today to save the deposit and achieve home ownership. In terms of planning, we're seeing massive high-rise go up everywhere. You can see it a lot in Brisbane. I mean, just incredible the change in the last 10 to 15 years. The 6 and 8 story buildings everywhere, from West End, right through the suburbs. So they're not adding the other infrastructure required, and I'll talk about why a bit later. But we're seeing all of the infrastructure overloaded by this densification, this high-rise, and just relying on the same relative amount of infrastructure. And you're seeing things like, I've used a Sydney statistic here because it's so frustrating living in Sydney now. Major road speeds have slumped by up to 25 kilometres an hour in the past just 2 years. So it's really reaching a point where things are very, very difficult on the roads. And the source there is the government body, the Roads and Maritime Service. The next point is environmental. And of course, whilst there are different views on climate, what we do know is that the greenhouse gas emissions are continuing to rise. And one of the reasons is we've got ever more people in Australia. So as you have ever more people, we're seeing greenhouse gas emissions go up. And a study by the University of Adelaide shows that at the same rate of migration, net migration and growth, by 2030, we'll have 10% more greenhouse gas emissions from human activities relative to a stable population. So at a time where we're trying to, our government and all of our major parties are saying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, they're running massive migration programs that are undermining our capacity to do that. So I want to focus a bit now on Queensland, because of course when in Queensland you have to talk about Queensland. That's in terms of, I've read a few articles here recently from the Fin Review, from the Courier Mail. Let me just take you through briefly an article in the Courier Mail regarding Infrastructure Minister Cameron Dick. He says population growth drives the economy. He says that Queensland is backing migration over asset sales. Let me take you through that. So the article is talking about Queensland is preferring the choice of high migration to continue driving growth and believes it can pay for the infrastructure needs of a bigger population without selling off public assets. Excuse me. He said that the Labor government had listened to the electorate and asset sales were off the agenda. We all know about the electricity and so forth, so that's off the agenda. But he's saying that they're choosing migration instead. Now, this is, to me, a false choice. When I hear you either have high migration or you have asset sales, that sounds like a false choice to me. Why would you need the asset sales to pay for more infrastructure if you didn't have high migration? Wouldn't a better solution to be slow down population growth, take the pressure off the infrastructure and not require the asset sales? So to me, the rapid population growth is, if you like, the economic problem masquerading as a cure. And we really need to also go back in time a little bit here in Queensland. Back in 2001, Queensland was experiencing extraordinary population growth. We all know about it under Premier Beattie and the like, you know, everyone from interstate and overseas coming to Queensland, about 1,500 people per week. Now, Mr. Beattie opened this, welcomed this growth with open arms. He, almost in daily media releases, he would trumpet this figure of proof that Queensland was doing well and, you know, it was a guarantee of ongoing economic growth. And of course, that's aggregate economic growth as opposed to per capita wealth. Now, then Treasurer Terry McEnroth delivered the 2001-02 state budget. And have a listen to these numbers. Queensland was carrying a modest debt of $3.3 billion. $3.3 billion. Remember that figure, and predicted a $250 million cash surplus. But at that point, a massive $5 billion capital works program was to be undertaken to meet demand for new road, rails, hospitals, schools and cultural institutions generated by those thousands of new Queenslanders. So this is about the time where John Howard started ramping up the population growth, and added to that was the intrastate migration. So across Queensland over the next 15 years, the government cut ribbons at all sorts of police stations and fire stations, new schools, sporting facilities, opera theatres, you name it. And there was also a $10 billion hospital rebuilding program, $10 billion water grid to drought-proof Queensland, $200 million cultural precinct, $400 million Suncorp Stadium, you name it, and they built it. There was just one problem. In the midst of this population growth-driven infrastructure building boom, Queensland went broke. Yeah. The trouble was that overwhelmingly the things that they built didn't make money, yet they cost more money to build and they had to be staffed and serviced. Basically, the theory of the pro-growth economist was and still is that all these people moving to Queensland would accelerate economic growth and generate increased taxes, of course, and which would pay off all of the upfront costs over time. It would cover it all, no worries. In the near future, you know, more people, economies of scale, you'd pay it all off. But it didn't work out that way. As I say, Queensland basically went broke, and today the state debt stands at $83 billion in the next few years. It will reach $83 billion. The AAA credit rating that went in 2009 may never be seen again. The mining boom is of course pretty much over. probably, and debt reduction proving very difficult. So fast forward to today, Jackie Trad, just in the news on the ABC, Jackie Trad, new Treasurer, says she makes no apologies for spending to drive the economy in terms of infrastructure. Ms Trad will hand down her first budget on Tuesday, just recently, which she said would include an infrastructure increase in terms of spending. The Palaszczuk government, she says, has made some very clear choices going forward, and that is we will borrow to build the infrastructure that our community now needs because of rapid growth. Our borrowings are sustainable, they're stable, and in return what we get is a huge delivery in terms of infrastructure projects that our state needs. Why? For rapid population growth. Does that sound familiar of the story just over the last 20 years? $3 billion in debt, profit in terms of, see you Larissa, profit in terms of the budget, to today a situation which really they can't get the debt under control. So the catchphrase now reads, Queensland, beautiful set of numbers one day, broke the next. Moving forward, of course, part of the answer, we say, is to have a more sustainable population policy. We think that Queensland and the states should be demanding that the federal government returns the migration program back to the normal sustainable level of 70,000 per year. We are a party that is for migration, but just at a rate that is manageable for the economy, for the environment in particular. Yes, it gives the federal government and the state governments a bigger GDP number to spruik around. It gives the federal government more revenue because they collect the income tax, but the costs are borne by the states and the costs are borne by the households, you and I, in toll roads, in higher house prices. Costs. I mean, some of us benefit from exploding house prices, there's no doubt about that. We're a party, unashamedly, that says house prices should be much more stable, like a Germany, and therefore we allocate our capital into our small businesses, our factories, our farms. So, back in the 1990s, bank lending used to be about 60% to business, about 25% to housing, and about 15% to personal loans. Now it's about 60% to housing. So our businesses, our factories, our farms are being starved of our capital, our mum and dad, or our superannuation funds. They're all speculating on property, not all of them, but too much speculating on property, creating an unequal society of haves and have-nots. We should be using our capital to invest in productive businesses and assets that add value, that really generate wealth for our broader society. So ending the property speculation boom and stabilising house prices should be something I think we aim for. So just a question on infrastructure. Why is it so difficult to deliver affordable infrastructure in our cities in particular? Our cities are already built up. They were planned. All the land is gone. So you can't really retrofit infrastructure now, massive infrastructure for double and triple the density in places like West End or wherever you want to look. So in short, due to, rightly or wrongly, low density planning in Australian cities, relatively low density planning, our major cities have reached diseconomies of scale. Now that's because, and obviously diseconomies of scale are the forces that cause governments to produce infrastructure like roads or schools or hospitals at ever increasing per unit costs. So whether it's a kilometre of road or a local school, the costs are going up through the roof because they don't own the land anymore, or they have to tunnel to build roads, or they have to build sky rails in places like Melbourne. So, those extra costs are not covered by the same relative taxes per person that come in, because the per unit cost to build for them now is higher. So that's one of the great reasons why we're having to sell assets off. That's one of the reasons why we've got austerity in budgets and increasing debt and deficit. So I'll give you an example. Sydney's North West Rail Link, $18 billion. These things are now $500 million to $1 billion per kilometre. Back when we owned the land, we could build something for between $1 million and $10 million a kilometre, depending on the type of road. So these exponential growth in costs is the diseconomies of scale I'm talking about. What are the major parties doing? They have an agreed approach. Don't talk about it. Suppress it. Don't allow public discussion. And the media, the two big media companies, News Limited, Fairfax, they rely on the property advertising. That's really the only thing keeping them profitable now. So realestate.com.au and domain.com.au. They're the two profitable arms of those newspaper groups. So add more people, more advertising, more property revenue. And of course the state governments think these short-term stamp duty injections are great. Just build some more high-rise around a train station and Bob's your uncle. You've got all the infrastructure you need. Oh, don't need any schools or hospitals or roads or public transport or sporting fields. The growth lobby, yes, that extends to big business. Of course, they like their more customers. The duopolies and oligopolies just add people to the big four banks. They make about $1,000 profit per person in Australia. So if you double the number of people, you double the profit of the big banks. And the big universities, obviously foreign students and the like, they're paying big fees for them too. So it's really we're fighting the system here. You can now add big unions. The ACTU recently signed up to a big Australia compact with the Australian industry group. So even the big unions are in on this. And I think the reason is that the big unions have a monopoly on some of these big infrastructure jobs. Look, I'm not anti-big business, I'm not anti-big union, but I'm pro the public interest. So we can't have these vocal minorities and vested interests dictating public policy. And I guess that aligns with what Cameron's saying on the scale you're talking about in government. What is the public saying? Well, overwhelmingly, the public is saying that we should have a lower level of immigration. The recent Essential Media national research shows 65% of Australians think that migration is too high. We're starting to get a bit more public discussion going, which is a good thing. We want a rational discussion about numbers. That's our aim. We think that the numbers should come down from 200,000 a year back to 70,000 a year. That also has, not only the economic benefits and the environmental benefits, but also the social benefits from the housing affordability and other issues, but also, more social cohesion. When there's a lower number, it's easier to integrate and work into the existing community and make sure we maintain our social cohesion. So within that 70-odd thousand, we could easily have 20 to 30,000 skilled migrants, highly skilled, 20 to 30,000 family reunions, generally the partner, and the same number of now as refugees, 14 to 20,000. So we could reverse those from up to 200 back down to 70. I guess just where to from here. It's clear to me that it's a difficult battle to get the media and politicians to debate the issue. They just want to suppress it. They want to keep it out of the news. But as I said, it is breaking through on and off. We've got obviously Sustainable Australia. We've got Dick Smith's been talking about it. There's a couple of other parties, the One Nation and the Cory Bernardi, also talk about it. We've got Tony Abbott and a few from the Liberal Party. I think Senator Dean Smith from WA just in the last 24 hours. So we're slowly building momentum to talk about this issue. From our point of view, we'd rather it just be talked about in terms of numbers, not trying to target any groups, but that's, it's a free society, so other people will want to talk about it in another way, but from our point of view, it's really about numbers. It is a difficult thing to get a high vote on in the electorate because often people are prioritising a more immediate concern, if you like, whether or not the economy is providing them with a job, whether or not they've got healthcare, whether or not cost of living is reasonable, housing and so forth. So a lot of the things we are talking about is secure jobs, affordable housing, but we'll link it back in and say, look, population is one of the issues we've got to get right. So in housing, we'd like to see significant tax reform to take away the speculation in investment, like negative gearing and capital gains. We'd like to see the end to or restriction of purchase to Australian citizens and long-term residents of Australian housing, and we'd like to see slower population growth. So it's just one of the things we need to do, but unless we're including it in the mix, it's like sort of swimming against the tide. When isolated on the issue, we think there should be more plebiscites. So if we could isolate that issue, it would be a much easier debate to win, and then the politicians wouldn't be able to ignore us. But we'll keep fighting on that. And I know that we do have, broadly speaking, the public on side, and the people are really feeling the growth now. It's hitting their daily lives, whether it's high rise, whether it's difficult to get into a hospital or your child to get into a local school, the congestion on the road. So it's really being felt now, and people are starting to talk more about it to their politicians. So I encourage that as well. So yeah, the majority, about 2/3 of people do agree with what we're saying. We've just got to get it on the radar and on the political discussion to a greater degree. I will wrap up there, and again, thank you for listening, and happy to take a few questions if you like.